Story number 1. The Last Motel. Ryan Collins had been driving for hours down a lonely stretch of road in the Nevada desert. The sun had set hours ago, and the vast emptiness around him was broken only by the occasional cactus or abandoned gas station. His phone had lost signal long ago, and he was exhausted, craving sleep. Just as his eyelids began to feel heavy, he spotted a neon sign blinking in the distance. Desert Star Motel, vacancy. The motel looked worn and isolated, but Ryan was too tired to care. He pulled into the gravel lot, noticing that only one other car was parked outside. Inside the reception area, a small bell sat on the counter. He rang it, and a man shuffled out from a back room. The man's face was expressionless, his eyes dull and staring. "One night," Ryan said, sliding cash across the counter. The man handed him a rusty key and gestured to room 9 without a word. When he entered, Ryan was greeted by the smell of stale air and old carpet. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper, peeling in places, and the only light came from a dim lamp on the bedside table. He checked his phone again. Still no signal. Sighing, he lay down on the bed, the springs creaking beneath him. As he drifted into sleep, a scratching sound woke him. It seemed to be coming from the wall next to the bed. Ryan sat up, frowning, listening. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trapped inside the wall. He banged on the wall, hoping to scare off whatever it was, but the sound only grew more intense. Frustrated and a little unnerved, he decided to go to the front desk and demand a different room. But as he opened his door, he saw the man from the reception standing right outside, staring at him. His expression was blank, and his eyes seemed empty, like he wasn't truly seeing Ryan. "Is there something wrong with the room?" Ryan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man tilted his head slightly, then turned and walked away down the hallway without a word. Confused, Ryan stepped back into his room and locked the door, hoping to sleep despite the strange encounter. But as he settled back into bed, the scratching returned, this time louder and closer. Determined to figure out what was causing it, he moved the bed and pressed his ear against the wall. The scratching now sounded like nails clawing directly on the other side. In a sudden surge of panic, he kicked the wall, creating a hole large enough to peer through. He expected to see a mouse or some kind of animal, but instead, he found an eye staring back at him from the other side. Ryan stumbled backward, heart racing. The eye blinked slowly, then disappeared. The scratching ceased, and everything went silent. He grabbed his keys, deciding to leave immediately. But as he reached the door, he noticed the lock wouldn't budge. He twisted it, pounded on it, and even tried kicking it down, but it was as if the door was sealed shut. Panic washed over him as he scanned the room, looking for another way out. Then he heard footsteps outside his door. He pressed his ear against it, listening. A soft voice, barely a whisper, spoke from the other side. "They never leave," it said, almost to itself. "Not once they see." Ryan backed away, horrified. He picked up a chair and smashed it against the window, but the glass didn't break. It felt like hitting solid concrete. The footsteps outside the door grew louder, stopping directly in front of his room. Slowly, the door creaked open, and the receptionist stepped inside, followed by two shadowy figures with faces obscured in darkness. Ryan pleaded, trying to explain he just wanted to leave, but they stared at him with the same vacant eyes. The figures approached him silently, and as they did, he noticed their faces, featureless, almost melted, with blank skin where eyes and mouths should have been. Ryan screamed, pressing himself against the far wall. But there was no escape. As the figures reached out toward him, his vision began to blur, and the last thing he saw before everything went dark was his own reflection in the window, his face slowly becoming just as featureless as theirs. The next morning, a new car pulled into the Desert Star Motel, and a weary traveler stepped out, looking for a place to rest. The reception bell rang, and a man shuffled out from the back room. His face was vacant, his eyes empty. He handed the new guest a rusty key and gestured to room 9 without a word. Story number 2. The Lost Subway. It was nearly midnight when Emma found herself alone on the subway platform in New York City. She had missed her train, and the last few people on the platform had disappeared down the stairs or into the dark tunnels. The lights flickered overhead, casting a cold, artificial glow on the empty space. She checked her phone, but it was dead, a typical end to an exhausting day. Suddenly, a train pulled into the station. The car was older, almost ancient-looking, with grimy windows and dull metallic walls. Despite its eerie appearance, Emma was relieved. She didn't want to wait any longer. She stepped aboard, and the doors slid shut behind her. Inside, the train was just as empty as the platform. The silence was unnerving, and she noticed a stale smell hanging in the air, as if the car hadn't been used in years. Emma chose a seat and looked around. The train jerked forward and began to move, but instead of picking up speed, it traveled slowly, almost as if it were dragging itself along the tracks. She glanced out the window, hoping to see the familiar city stations pass by, but all she saw was endless darkness outside. No lights, no signs, just blackness. Minutes passed, then longer, and she started to feel uneasy. Emma pulled out her phone, instinctively trying to check the time even though it was dead. She looked around the car again and noticed something odd. She wasn't alone anymore. A man had appeared at the far end of the car. His head was lowered, his shoulders hunched. His clothes were dirty, tattered, as though he'd been wandering for days. She wondered how she hadn't noticed him before. She cleared her throat, trying to sound casual. "Excuse me, do you know when this train stops next?" The man lifted his head slowly, his gaze vacant and unfocused. His face was expressionless, as if he hadn't heard her at all. Emma shivered, feeling a cold wave of dread. She turned away, hoping to ignore him, but when she glanced back, another figure had appeared. This one was a woman, sitting a few seats away, her face hidden under a hood. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Emma's unease grew as she realized more people were slowly appearing, filling the seats one by one, all with the same lifeless expressions. None of them acknowledged her. They sat motionless, eyes fixed ahead. Her pulse quickened, and she felt trapped in the strange silence of the car, her heart pounding in her ears. As the train continued its journey through the void, Emma decided she had to get off at the next stop, if there was one. She moved to the door between cars, hoping she could find an emergency exit, but the door was locked tight. Desperately, she pressed the buttons, banged her fists on the glass, but nothing happened. She turned back to see that every seat was now occupied. The figures stared ahead, their faces shadowed, hands resting limply on their laps. One of them, an elderly woman with a thin, sallow face, turned her head slowly toward Emma. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, there was a low, wheezing breath, followed by a hollow whisper. "You should not be here." Emma backed away, panic rising. She rushed to the next door, hoping to move to another car, but as she looked back, the figures were no longer sitting. They were standing, blocking her path, their empty eyes fixed on her. The train seemed to be speeding up now, rushing through the darkness. She closed her eyes, trying to convince herself that it was all a bad dream. But when she opened them, she was no longer alone in the train car. One of the passengers, a tall man with hollow eyes and an expressionless face, was standing right in front of her. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. He reached out, his cold hand pressing against her shoulder, and whispered, "You can't leave. None of us can." The train plunged deeper into the dark. moving faster now, shaking violently as if it would come off the tracks. The last thing Emma saw was the man's vacant eyes, just before everything faded to black. When the train pulled into the next station, it was empty. The doors slid open, but no one got off. The platform remained still, lifeless, as if no train had passed at all. Story number 3. The last check-in. It had been a long road trip for Mark and his friends Sarah, Jake, and Emma. They'd been driving for hours, the desolate highway stretching endlessly in front of them. After a day of nothing but open road, they were all eager for a place to rest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they came across a small, isolated motel tucked away from the main road. Its flickering neon sign read, "Rest Easy Motel," but it felt anything but restful. "We're not too far from the city. Just need a quick stop to crash for the night," Mark said, glancing at his friends. They had little choice. The next town was miles away, and they were all exhausted. The motel had an eerie, forgotten vibe to it. The building was old, and the parking lot was barely half full. But the tiredness in their eyes pushed them to ignore the uncomfortable feeling settling in their stomachs. They parked and headed to the lobby, the front door creaking as they entered. Behind the front desk was a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a worn-out uniform. His face was unreadable, his eyes sunken into dark circles. "Check in?" he asked, his voice monotone. "We'll take a room for the night," Mark said, trying to sound friendly. The man didn't respond immediately. He reached into a drawer and slid a set of keys across the counter. "Room 8. It's all I've got left." The group exchanged uncertain glances but accepted the keys. As they made their way to the room, they noticed the motel felt strangely quiet, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something sour. There was no sound from the other rooms, no movement from the parking lot. It was as if the whole place was abandoned, despite the dim light in the windows. The room itself was small, with peeling wallpaper and a musty carpet. A single bed with mismatched blankets sat in the middle of the room. A strange, metallic smell lingered in the air, like rust. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, but none of them dared to open it just yet. As they set their bags down and began to settle in, they noticed something unsettling. The wallpaper in one corner of the room was scratched, as though something had been violently scraped against it. Mark moved closer, trying to make out the marks, but the moment he touched the wall, a sudden chill ran through his body. "Guys, we need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. The others turned to him, concern spreading across their faces. Before they could leave, there was a knock on the door. Startled, Mark opened it, only to find nobody standing there. Just a small, folded piece of paper lying on the floor. He picked it up cautiously and opened it. The note read, "You shouldn't have come. You never should have come." The air seemed to grow heavier, the walls closing in on them. Sarah looked around, her skin crawling. "This place, it feels wrong," she muttered. Without another word, they grabbed their things and rushed to leave the room. As they reached the door, they heard it, footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps coming from the hallway. Mark's heart raced as he spun around to look out the peephole. Through the small glass, he could barely make out the silhouette of a person standing at the end of the hall. They were moving slowly toward the room, their body hunched at an unnatural angle. Their hands hung limp by their sides, and their feet scraped against the floor. Mark's blood ran cold as he recognized the figure. It was the man from the front desk, but his face was twisted, his eyes wide and unblinking. Panic set in. Mark turned the lock, but the handle rattled violently. The footsteps continued, now louder, closer. Then the power went out, plunging them into darkness. The four friends huddled together, not knowing what to do. They could hear the man's labored breathing on the other side of the door, then the sound of someone, scraping against the walls. Emma gasped, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone, but it had no signal. Suddenly, the door slammed open, sending them all stumbling backward. Standing there was the front desk man, but he wasn't the same. His face was a grotesque mask of rage, his eyes empty, and his mouth was twisted into a hollow grin. He moved with terrifying speed, his hands reaching out to grab them. Mark pushed Emma behind him as the man lunged forward, but before they could escape, the lights flickered back on, revealing something worse. The entire hallway was filled with bodies, motionless, pale, and staring, as if they had been waiting for years. The motel was a tomb. The man's hand shot out, grabbing Sarah by the arm. She screamed as he pulled her into the darkness. The last thing they heard was her frantic cry for help, followed by an eerie silence. The door slammed shut, and the motel seemed to return to its unnatural stillness. The group was never seen again. When police arrived the next day, the motel was completely deserted. The room was empty, the beds made, and there were no signs of any struggle. But in the bathroom, the words, "You shouldn't have come," were scrawled across the mirror in what looked like fresh blood. And so, the motel remained, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers to make the mistake of checking in. Story number 4. The Eyes in the Rear View. It was a quiet night when Emily decided to take the long, scenic route back to her apartment. She had been at a work event all evening, and after a few drinks, she felt the need to clear her mind with a drive. The roads outside the city were empty, save for the occasional passing car, and the headlights of her sedan cut through the thick night. Her car hummed along the road. The only sound breaking the stillness was the gentle tapping of the rain against the windows. She glanced at the rearview mirror, noticing the reflection of her car's headlights shining brightly behind her. But then she froze. The headlights weren't just behind her, they were getting closer. Too close. Emily felt her pulse quicken, and she nervously adjusted her grip on the steering wheel. The car behind her was now so close that she could barely make out its details. It was an old, dark sedan with tinted windows, a car that hadn't been there a moment ago. At first, she thought it might be a coincidence, another driver on the same road. But the strange thing was, this car never pulled ahead, nor did it give her any space. It stayed right behind her, matching her speed. Her hands tightened around the wheel. "Come on, just pass already," she muttered under her breath. But the car didn't pass. Instead, it seemed to mirror her every move. Growing more anxious, Emily accelerated slightly, hoping to get some distance between her and the strange vehicle. But the car behind her did the same. She glanced at the rearview mirror again, her breath catching in her throat. The headlights were still glaring at her, only now they were no longer reflecting her own. The vehicle was different. The car behind her had no lights, no reflection. In a moment of sheer panic, Emily took a sharp turn onto a side street, hoping the other car would continue straight. But to her terror, it followed, its dark silhouette still looming in the distance. "Okay, this is insane," she said, her voice trembling. Her heart raced, and her thoughts began to spiral. She could see no signs of life anywhere on the street. It was just empty houses, darkened windows, and the oppressive quiet of the rain-soaked night. Desperate to get away, Emily swerved onto a narrow dirt road, hoping the car would turn away. But it didn't. It kept following, closer now, its headlights still glaring. She could hear the faint sound of the engine revving in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The road was becoming more isolated, with fewer homes and trees closing in on both sides. Emily's breath was shallow, her hands sweaty on the steering wheel. The lights from the car behind her flickered briefly, and in that moment, she thought she saw something in the rearview mirror, two dark figures staring back at her. Her heart hammered in her chest. The figures were watching her, their eyes wide and hollow. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she tried to focus on the road, but fear was clouding her vision. She dared not look back again. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from the rear of her car. She jerked the wheel, the tires screeching on the wet dirt road as she swerved. The thump was followed by another. Someone, or something, was hitting her car. Her pulse raced. She had to get away. With one final surge of adrenaline, Emily slammed the pedal to the floor, racing down the road as fast as she could. The car behind her remained on her tail, relentless. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour now, making it almost impossible to see the road. Then, with a screech of tires and a loud crash, Emily's car hit something. No, someone. She couldn't see who or what it was, but she felt the sickening impact. Her heart stopped as her car jolted forward, spinning out of control. The headlights flickered, and the car skidded off the road into the muddy ditch, coming to a sudden halt. The world was eerily quiet, save for the soft sound of rain tapping on the roof. Emily sat there, frozen, unable to move. Her mind was racing, heart pounding, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She was alive, but at what cost? Then she heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming closer. The heavy, wet sound of shoes dragging through the mud. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she glanced toward the rearview mirror one last time. The figures were there, standing behind her in the storm. Their dark eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and their mouths stretched into grotesque, hollow smiles. They were staring at her, waiting for something. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but she couldn't move. In the reflection of her mirror, one of the figures suddenly reached out, its hand dragging across the glass. Emily screamed, but it was too late. The figure's fingers wrapped around the back of her head, and before she could scream again, everything went black. Hours later, a passing driver would find Emily's car abandoned on the side of the road. Her door was open, the seatbelt still fastened. No signs of a struggle. No signs of life. And as for the figures, they were never seen again, but the car behind Emily's, the one that followed her, would appear again. Only now, it had no headlights at all. Story number 5. The Descent into Greystone Asylum. It had been a long day for Ben Parker. The young journalist had just wrapped up an investigation on a string of unsolved disappearances in the nearby town of Greystone. As he reviewed his notes in the cramped motel room, he noticed something strange. Among the people who'd gone missing, many of them had connections to Greystone Asylum, a notorious mental institution that had been abandoned for decades. Curiosity gnawed at him. He'd heard the rumors. People whispered that Greystone Asylum had once been home to the most dangerous criminals and the most disturbing minds in the state. Patients, they said, were subjected to cruel experiments, and many of them had died under mysterious circumstances. But the asylum had been closed after a fire decades ago, its doors locked, its secrets buried. Ben knew he had to see it for himself. The next morning, with the sun still low in the sky, Ben drove out to Greystone. The roads leading to the asylum were desolate, the land around it withering away under years of neglect. As he approached the towering structure, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The building loomed in front of him, its windows dark, its walls crumbling. He parked his car by the rusted gates, the sound of the engine cutting out abruptly in the oppressive silence. Ben grabbed his camera and a flashlight before heading toward the asylum's back entrance. The rusted door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor beneath his feet groaned with every step. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows against the decaying walls. He paused to snap some photos, capturing the eerie emptiness that had overtaken the asylum. But something didn't feel right. The air, cold and still, seemed to press against him, like something was watching. Ben shook off the unease and pressed on, making his way through the crumbling halls. He passed empty rooms, some with overturned furniture, others with shattered glass. As he wandered deeper into the building, he came across an old patient ledger, its pages yellowed with age and stained with something that resembled ink, though it had long since faded. He flipped through the pages, his eyes widening as he read the names and descriptions of former patients. Some of them had died in the asylum, their deaths marked as natural causes, or unexplained incidents. Others had simply vanished. Then, he found something that sent a chill through him. One name was underlined several times, as if someone had gone to great lengths to emphasize it. Catherine Blackwell, the note read, severely disturbed. Known for violent outbursts. Often speaks of voices in the walls. No family. Lost in the fire of 1972. Ben's heart pounded. Was this one of the missing people connected to the recent disappearances? Suddenly, the floorboards groaned loudly, followed by a soft shuffle from behind. Ben's blood ran cold. He turned quickly, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing. Only the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room. His breath quickened as the unease turned into something deeper, fear. The building seemed to be alive with something, watching him, waiting for him. His mind raced. Maybe it was just his nerves. Maybe the silence had gotten to him. But then, he heard it again. The shuffle. But this time, it was closer. Ben stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He snapped his flashlight around, illuminating a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, hunched over, her long hair hanging in front of her face, obscuring most of her features. She was muttering something under her breath, her hands moving erratically. The sound was low at first, like a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. They're here. Ben's eyes widened. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen. The woman took a step forward, her eyes now visible beneath her hair, empty, black, and hollow. Before he could react, a loud crash came from somewhere deeper in the asylum. The walls trembled, and Ben felt a cold draft wash over him, as if something had opened a door that should have stayed shut. In that moment, he bolted, his flashlight flickering wildly as he raced down the hallway, not daring to look back. His footsteps echoed off the walls as he turned corners and pushed open doors, searching for any way out. He reached what he thought was the exit, only to find himself standing in front of a small room with a single metal door. It was locked, but he could hear breathing on the other side, labored, raspy, and rhythmic. He backed away slowly, his eyes darting across the dark room. Then, he saw her again. Catherine Blackwell. She was standing just inside the doorframe, her face inches from his, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice hollow and rasping. "They'll never let you leave." Before he could scream, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the dark, cold room. The breathing grew louder, the shadows closed in, and then, nothing. Just silence. The police would find his car abandoned at the asylum gates the next morning, his camera and belongings scattered near the entrance. But Ben Parker himself was never found. Some say he became just another lost soul, another victim of Greystone Asylum, whose cries would echo in the walls forever. And on nights when the wind is just right, you can hear them. The whispers, the voices that never left. Story number 6. The Last Ride. It was late, around 1 a.m., when Erica James found herself stuck on the side of the road. The weather had turned unexpectedly. What had been a warm night had turned into a cold, damp mess. Her car had sputtered and stopped, refusing to start again. She wasn't far from a small, rural town, but there were no lights, no houses nearby. The only sound was the rustling of trees in the wind and the occasional chirp of crickets. Erica had been on her way to visit her cousin in a neighboring town, but now she found herself stranded on an empty stretch of road. With no cell service and no other cars in sight, Erica was left with little choice but to wait. She stepped out of the car, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The wind was biting, and there was a strange heaviness in the air. Something felt off about the place. She glanced down the road, thinking she could walk to town, but decided against it. The night was too dark and the road too desolate. As she stood there, pondering her next move, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over her. Finally, someone was coming. The car drew closer, its engine rumbling in the silence. It was a large, black SUV with tinted windows, and it slowed as it neared Erica's car. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man behind the wheel. "You need a ride?" the man asked in a low, gravelly voice. Erica hesitated for a moment. Something about the man's demeanor felt off, but the thought of being stranded here longer made her anxious. "I'm just trying to get to the town nearby," Erica said, trying to sound casual. "My car broke down." The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I can give you a lift. It's not safe out here in the dark." Reluctantly, Erica agreed. She figured it was better than standing out here alone. The man motioned for her to get in, and she climbed into the back seat. As she settled in, she noticed the interior of the SUV was unusually dark. The windows were so tinted she couldn't see outside, and the atmosphere felt stifling, almost suffocating. The man didn't say a word as he started driving again, and Erica tried to make small talk, but he remained silent. The road seemed to stretch on forever. They passed by fields and empty farmhouses, but there were no other cars, no sign of civilization. The silence in the car was oppressive, and Erica couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced at the rearview mirror but couldn't make out the man's face, only his dark silhouette. After what felt like an eternity, Erica looked out the side window and realized they were no longer on the road to the town. They were driving down a narrow, winding path that seemed to lead into a dense forest. Panic started to rise in her chest. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man finally spoke, his voice colder than before. "You'll see soon enough." Erica's heart began to race. Her instincts were screaming at her to get out of the car, but she didn't know where to go. She was trapped. She scanned the interior of the SUV again, her eyes landing on the handles of a couple of large, rusted tools in the back seat. She didn't know why they were there, but the sight of them made her stomach turn. She tried the door handle, but it was locked. "Let me out," Erica said, her voice growing louder, more panicked. "Where are we going? This isn't the way to town." The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned down a gravel road, and the trees closed in on either side, blocking any light from the moon. The air in the car grew colder, and the stench of something rotten filled her nose. Erica tried again to open the door, but the lock held firm. "Please," Erica pleaded. "Let me out." The SUV came to a sudden stop, the tires grinding to a halt on the gravel. Erica's heart hammered in her chest. They had reached an old, decrepit house at the end of the road, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. It looked abandoned, but the lights from the SUV illuminated the place in an eerie glow. The man turned to face her, his face still obscured by the darkness of the vehicle. "We're here," he said in a low whisper. Erica's mind raced. She wasn't sure what this man had planned, but she knew it wasn't good. She scrambled for the door again, and this time, it opened. Without thinking, she bolted out of the car, stumbling into the overgrown yard of the house. She could hear the man's footsteps behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Her heart was pounding in her ears as she ran, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder. She made it to the front door of the house and threw it open, desperately hoping to find a way out. The interior was dark, musty, and filled with the smell of decay. But as she stepped inside, her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. The house wasn't empty. It was filled with people who had been trapped here for far too long. They were all sitting in a circle, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They didn't speak, didn't move. They just stared at her, unblinking. Behind her, she heard the man's voice again, more urgent this time. "You should have stayed in the car." Before she could react, the door slammed shut, and the darkness consumed her. The police would later find Erica's car on the side of the road, abandoned and empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues, just her personal belongings left behind. But Erica James would never be found, and the house remained as it always had been, quiet, abandoned, and waiting for the next person to make the mistake of accepting a ride in the dark. Story number 7. The Midnight Caller. It had been a long day for Rachel Turner. She was finally home after a grueling shift at the diner, and she was looking forward to a quiet night. Her apartment was small but cozy, nestled on the 3rd floor of an old building in a quiet neighborhood of Kansas City. It was just after midnight when she collapsed onto the couch, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. She picked up her phone, scrolling through some messages from friends, when she noticed something strange, a missed call. The caller ID was blocked, and there was no voicemail. Rachel frowned, uncertain. She never received calls this late, especially from a blocked number. She shrugged it off, assuming it was probably a wrong number or some sort of telemarketer. But then the phone rang again. The blocked number flashed on the screen, and Rachel hesitated. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but her curiosity got the better of her. She swiped the screen to answer the call, holding the phone to her ear. "Hello?" she said, trying to keep her voice calm. There was no answer, just an unsettling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then a soft, raspy breath echoed through the speaker, followed by a low, whispering voice. "Rachel," the voice said, barely audible. "I've been waiting." Her blood ran cold. It was almost like the voice was coming from inside the room with her, as though whoever was on the other end knew exactly where she was. She gripped the phone tighter, looking around the apartment, her heart racing. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "What do you want?" The voice didn't respond at first. Instead, there was a faint scraping sound, like nails running across glass. Then, the voice spoke again, its tone low and full of menace. "You don't know me, but I know you. I know what you've done." Rachel felt a chill crawl up her spine. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had she been involved in something she had forgotten? She had no enemies, no debts, nothing that would warrant a call like this. But the voice seemed to know too much. "Stop calling," Rachel said, her voice trembling now. "Whoever this is, you're scaring me." Another breath came through the phone, heavier this time. It sounded like whoever was on the other end was in pain, struggling to breathe. "I'm already here," the voice whispered, "and I've been watching." The line went dead. Rachel sat there, her hands still gripping the phone, trying to steady her breathing. Her apartment felt suffocatingly quiet, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the city below. But something was different now, she could feel it. It wasn't just a phone call. It was the air, the sense that someone, or something, was in the apartment with her. Her mind raced with possibilities, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She stood up and checked the locks on the windows and doors, ensuring they were secure. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, the unease lingered. She decided to call the police, just to report the strange call. But as she dialed the number, her phone rang again, another blocked number. Her stomach dropped. Without thinking, Rachel answered the call, but this time, there was no sound. Just silence, and then the faintest echo of breathing in her ear. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The room felt too quiet, too still. She couldn't shake the sense that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaking. The phone clicked, and then the voice came again, but it was closer now. Almost too close. It sounded like it was right next to her ear. "I'm in your apartment," the voice hissed. Rachel's heart leaped into her throat. She dropped the phone, her eyes wide with fear. She turned around quickly, looking at the dark hallway leading into the bedroom, the bathroom door ajar, and the kitchen at the far end of the room. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But she could feel it, the presence, the tension in the air. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen, her hand shaking as she gripped the cold metal. Slowly, she backed toward the door, her eyes flicking between every corner, every shadow. She had to get out. There was no way she was staying here any longer. But as she reached for the door handle, she froze. There, just behind the door, was a shadow, slightly taller than her, shifting ever so slightly, almost as if it was breathing. Her pulse raced as she took a step back, her eyes locked on the shape in the dark. She knew she wasn't alone. Before she could react, the door slammed open with a deafening crash. A figure in a black hooded cloak stood in the doorway, their face hidden in shadow. The figure didn't say a word but stepped forward, its heavy breathing the only sound that filled the room. Rachel screamed, but the figure lunged at her, and before she could even react, everything went black. The next morning, Rachel's apartment was found empty. Her phone was lying on the floor next to a broken lamp, the screen cracked. No signs of struggle, no blood, no clues, just an eerie silence that hung in the air. Rachel Turner was never found. Weeks later, the phone records would reveal something chilling. The blocked calls had been traced back to her own phone number. And the last call Rachel had received had been made from inside her apartment. Story number 8. The Silent Watcher. Tyler Simmons had always been an adventurous soul, the kind of guy who loved a good thrill. He had explored abandoned houses, spent hours in dark forests, and even stayed overnight in the haunted rooms of a local hotel. But nothing prepared him for the horrors he would experience one cold October night. Tyler had just returned home from a long day of work. His small apartment in downtown Detroit was the perfect retreat after a day of dealing with the chaos of his office job. It was an old building, creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, but he didn't mind. He was used to it. All he wanted was to relax in front of the TV, maybe play some video games, and then sleep. But as he walked through the door, something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and the usual hum of the city outside seemed strangely muffled. He shrugged it off, blaming it on the stress of the day. After all, his apartment had always had its quirks, especially when the weather changed. Tyler dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter and kicked off his shoes. He reached for the remote control, flicking through channels, but nothing could grab his attention. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something, a shadow. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe the blinds were slightly open, and the streetlights outside were casting odd reflections. But as he turned toward the dark corner of his living room, he realized it was something more. A figure, tall and thin, stood perfectly still by the window, almost blending into the darkness. His heart skipped a beat. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It didn't move, it just stood there, its outline faint but unmistakable. For a moment, Tyler wondered if someone had broken into his apartment. He grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, feeling the weight of it in his hand as he cautiously approached the figure. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. "Who's there?" There was no answer. The figure remained motionless, its face hidden in the shadows. Tyler's pulse quickened. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the strange silhouette. He was almost close enough to touch it when, suddenly, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, like it had melted into the walls. Tyler stood frozen, the lamp still gripped tightly in his hands. He blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he imagined it? Was he seeing things? He wasn't sure, but the feeling of unease lingered. Determined to shake off his fear, Tyler decided to take a walk. The cool night air would clear his mind, he thought. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, trying to push the strange encounter to the back of his mind. As he stepped onto the street, the world felt oddly silent. The usual noise of the city, the distant honking of car horns, the hum of streetlights, was strangely absent. It was almost as if the city had held its breath. Tyler walked for a few blocks, but the unsettling feeling followed him, like someone was watching his every move. He couldn't shake the sense that something was lurking behind him. Every now and then, he'd glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see the same figure from his apartment. But there was nothing. After a while, he returned home, hoping that the walk would help him clear his mind. But as soon as he stepped through the door, the atmosphere inside his apartment felt wrong. He wasn't alone. There, standing in the same dark corner of the room, was the figure again. It hadn't moved. It hadn't even blinked. It was just there, its shape barely visible in the shadows, but now Tyler could see something different. Its outline was clearer, sharper, and as his eyes adjusted, he could make out something even more disturbing, its eyes. Those eyes. Empty. Hollow. Black. Tyler's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and it felt as though it was peering directly into his soul, a chilling presence that froze him in place. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound, a low, raspy whisper that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Tyler," the voice hissed, cold and distorted, like a breath from a grave. "I've been waiting." Tyler's legs finally gave way, and he stumbled backward, his mind racing for an explanation, anything to make sense of this nightmare. He turned to flee, but as soon as he took a step, the lights flickered, plunging the apartment into complete darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his phone, but the screen remained black. He tried the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the world around him had turned against him, trapping him inside with whatever nightmare was haunting him. In the pitch-black room, he heard it again, those whispering breaths so close now. Tyler's pulse raced, and he felt the presence drawing nearer, felt the heat of something unseen closing in around him. His breath came in short gasps as he turned in every direction, searching for the figure, but there was nothing. It was as if the room itself was swallowing him whole. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the air grew cold, too cold. His skin prickled with a terrible chill, and he felt his consciousness begin to fade. The last thing he saw, just before everything went black, was those empty, hollow eyes staring back at him from the darkness. Tyler Simmons was never seen again. In the days that followed, his apartment was searched, his belongings catalogued, and his case filed away as just another missing persons report. But no one could explain why his phone, his keys, and even his shoes were found neatly by the door, as if he had left them there willingly. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence, only the strange, lingering feeling that something, someone, was still watching. And the whispers, which could still be heard late at night, in the empty corners of the building. Story number 9. The Hollow Grove. It was a cold October evening when Mark Turner received the invitation. A small, unassuming envelope was placed on his desk at work, with no return address. Inside was a simple card, the letters barely visible in the dim office light. "Join us for a gathering at Hollow Grove. Midnight." He had no idea who sent it, but the allure of something secretive, something different, was too much to ignore. Hollow Grove was an old, forgotten part of the forest just outside the city. Mark had heard rumors about it, about strange happenings and disappearances, but it was just another urban legend, right? Or so he thought. Curiosity gnawed at him all day, and by the time midnight arrived, Mark found himself driving down a winding road toward the grove. The trees loomed over him like silent, ancient sentinels, their bare branches reaching for the dark sky. The road was narrow, barely illuminated by the weak beams of his car headlights. He arrived at the grove, and a strange sense of unease washed over him. The place looked like something out of a forgotten horror movie, overgrown, abandoned, and eerily quiet. There was a single, dilapidated cabin in the center of the grove, smoke rising from its chimney. Mark parked his car and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. The sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, seemed to vanish as he approached the cabin. It was as if the world itself had gone silent, waiting. He walked up to the door and knocked. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a single, flickering lantern. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. He stepped inside cautiously, unsure of what to expect. In the center of the room stood a long wooden table surrounded by several people, all dressed in dark, hooded cloaks. They didn't move as Mark entered, but their eyes, pale and cold, followed his every step. One of them stood up, a tall figure, their face obscured by a deep hood. The figure extended a hand toward Mark, its gesture inviting him to sit. "Welcome," the figure said in a voice that seemed to echo unnaturally in the cabin. "We've been waiting for you." Mark hesitated but decided to sit, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave. The figure across from him lowered its hood, revealing a face that seemed both familiar and wrong. The skin was too smooth, too pale. The eyes were wide and glassy, staring at him with an unsettling intensity. "We need you," the figure said. "It's time for the ritual." The others around the table remained silent, their eyes never leaving him. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. What kind of ritual?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "What's going on here?" The figure smiled, a smile that stretched too wide, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. "The ritual of the hollow," the figure explained. "To join the grove forever, to become one with the earth." Before Mark could protest, the door to the cabin slammed shut. The temperature dropped drastically, and a cold wind howled through the cracks in the walls. The lights flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the room. Panic surged through Mark as he tried to get up, but his legs felt heavy, as if something was pulling him down. He looked around, and the other cloaked figures were no longer seated. They had surrounded him, their faces now visible in the pale glow of the lantern. Their skin was no longer human, pale, smooth, almost translucent. Their eyes were completely black, void of any emotion or humanity. "Please stop," Mark pleaded, trying to stand, but his body refused to obey. The leader of the group, the one who had welcomed him, took a step forward. "It's too late. The ritual has already begun." Mark's vision blurred as his body felt numb. His heart raced in terror as he realized what was happening. The figures began chanting, a low, guttural sound that resonated in his chest. The words were foreign, incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. He was the sacrifice. Suddenly, the ground beneath him cracked open, splitting wide as the others grabbed him by the arms, pulling him toward the center of the room. The floor was no longer wood, but dark earth, moist and thick with decay. His feet sank into the ground, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow him whole. Mark fought with all his strength, but his body was weak, his mind clouded by fear and confusion. As the chanting grew louder, the air grew thicker, suffocating him. His screams were drowned out by the oppressive weight of the darkness closing in around him. "Welcome to the grove," the leader whispered in his ear, just before everything went black. Mark was never seen again. The next morning, the cabin was empty. No signs of struggle, no trace of Mark, nothing but a faint, lingering smell of decay in the air. The ground around the cabin had returned to its normal state, the earth solid and untouched. And though the authorities searched, there were no clues, no evidence, just more rumors. Those who dared to venture near Hollow Grove at night could still hear the faint whispers of those who had gone before. The others, the hollow ones, still waited, their eyes forever searching for new souls to join the darkness. No one ever spoke of the ritual again, and Hollow Grove remained silent. Story number 10. The Forgotten Church. The moon was full and hung high in the sky like a pale, distant eye watching over the world. For Sarah Matthews, the night had just begun to unfold with unease. She had taken the wrong turn, thinking she was heading toward the familiar city lights. Instead, she found herself on a dark, empty road, with only the faintest glow from her headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Her phone had died, and the GPS was useless out here. There was no sign of civilization, just trees, shadows, and the occasional rustle in the wind. After driving for what felt like hours, Sarah noticed a faint silhouette in the distance. A church. She breathed a sigh of relief. A place to stop, recharge, maybe even find someone who could help her find her way. As she pulled into the gravel parking lot, the church appeared almost untouched by time. Its Gothic architecture stood proudly against the night sky, with high, arched windows and a bell tower that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. But there was something wrong about it. The air was still, too still, and the closer Sarah got to the church, the more the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She stepped out of her car and approached the entrance. The wooden doors creaked as they opened, as though inviting her in. Inside, the air was thick and cool. The dim glow from a few flickering candles illuminated the old pews, which looked untouched for years. Dust danced in the air, swirling with the light from the candles. The place was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of something scratching from deep within the walls. A voice echoed from the shadows. "Are you lost, my dear?" Sarah jumped, her heart racing. From the corner of the room, a figure slowly emerged, an old man, hunched over and dressed in a black robe. His face was obscured by the darkness, but his voice was clear, cold. She didn't want to speak, but the pressure of the moment forced her to. "Yes, I think I took a wrong turn," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Many do," the old man replied. "You are far from where you need to be. But now that you're here, you must join us." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Join you?" The man nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. "Yes. We have waited for you, child." Sarah's heart raced in fear. She took a few cautious steps backward, unsure of what he meant, but her mind couldn't grasp the dread that was now taking hold of her. The man's gaze, although hard to see in the low light, was unblinking, his eyes hollow and empty. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a twisted, unsettling grin, as if he was well aware of her fear. "We are the forgotten ones, those who were cast aside by the living, those who remain here in the darkness, in the stillness, awaiting those like you." Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on her. The walls, once distant, seemed to draw closer. Sarah could feel the temperature drop, and the air became thick with something she couldn't name. The candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that twisted unnaturally along the walls. "Join us," the man repeated, his voice growing louder, his tone more insistent. From the shadows, other figures began to emerge. More people, all dressed in the same black robes, their faces pale, their eyes sunken and lifeless. Sarah's stomach churned as she realized these weren't just any people. They were ghosts, trapped in this forsaken place, waiting for someone to join their ranks. Their voices joined together in a low chant, echoing off the stone walls. They began moving closer, surrounding her in a tight circle. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away. She turned to run but found the doors of the church had disappeared. The walls were solid now, the windows covered by an impenetrable blackness. Her breathing grew frantic as she spun around, desperately searching for an escape. The old man's voice rang out again, this time sounding more like a command. "You will join us, child. You will be one of us." The figures closed in, their outstretched hands reaching for her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin. The smell of decay and dampness filled her nostrils, overwhelming her senses. She stumbled backward, tripping over one of the pews, and fell to the ground. The cold stone beneath her was like ice. One of the figures knelt beside her, its face now visible in the dim candlelight. It was a woman, her face a hollow mask of death, her skin a sickly gray. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her mouth agape, as if caught in an eternal scream. But no sound came from her lips. "You will never leave," the woman whispered. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the darkness around her thickened. The shadows seemed to reach for her, pulling her into the cold grip of the church. The old man's hands hovered over her, and she could feel the weight of the darkness press down on her chest. "You are one of us now," he murmured, as his hands closed around her throat. The last thing Sarah saw was the face of the woman, her eyes gleaming with hollow emptiness. Then, everything went black. The next morning, the church stood silent once more. The windows remained covered by a thick black fog, blocking out the sun. No one came to check on Sarah. No one even noticed she was gone. And the forgotten ones remained, waiting for their next visitor.